Hey, Cypher here. We've been seeing a lot of coverage about the US Post Office. A lot of folks talk about the history of it, but generally in piecemeal fashion. The fact most of this commentary lacks is that the Post Office has always been a political tool. Arguably, that comes from its very inception. Interestingly enough, what it has been used for over the years has changed substantially, but it has always been a harbinger of the up-and-coming dominant ideology. The post office is a cornerstone of our democracy, and in fact, voting by mail is nothing new, which Mr. Beat is talking about in his episode. So be sure to check that out. We're doing a bit of a collaboration. It's not just important for voting, but from the earliest days of the Republic, we have depended on the post office to inform the people, thereby making them better voters. Unlike elsewhere, the postal system in the United States is uniquely important. This video is sponsored by viewers like you and private internet access. Instead of letter writing, most of us use email. We'll see later that the United States Postal Service actually had some involvement in the development of email, but it's all run by private corporations nowadays. A helpful tool for keeping some of their peering eyes from your internet activity is a VPN. It allows you to disguise your IP address by routing all your traffic through a proxy server. I normally try to make these promo sequences somewhat related to history, but when PIA reached out, I said, let's do it, because I've been using their service for years. They're cheap, reliable, and have thousands of servers in 70 countries. If you want to watch region-locked content, like stuff on Amazon, Netflix, and the BBC, then just connect to a server in that region. It's that simple. Off to the UK!
And it looks as though we're in for a splendid afternoon sport on this, the 127th Upper Class Twit of the Year show.
Now Germany. And somewhere in Central Asia, I guess.
We're nearing Turkestan.
They really let you go all around the world. You can use it on pretty much whatever platform you need. Plus, since they refuse to log anything, and you can pay with any number of methods, quite a few that are anonymous, your data is safer while you use their service. So click on the link below to get a 77% discount and 3 months free. Plus, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee. Before we get to the internet, though, we've got to go way back to colonial times. Prior to the American Revolution, mail in the colonies was carried out by individuals who received a grant from the British Crown. They created a more generalized postage system, hence why the highest two in the colonies were called Postmaster Generals. In 1753, Ben Franklin became one of them, and in fact, he was the first Postmaster General to turn a profit in 1760 during the French and Indian War. As he became increasingly radicalized against British tyranny during the period after that war, he eventually confronted the Privy Council over some controversial letters from the governor of Massachusetts in 1774, and was officially sacked only 2 days later. No matter, Franklin turned to a fellow printer named William Goddard to set up their own independent postal system. Soon, that system was co-opted by the War of Independence. Just a few weeks after the first battles, a new Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. Franklin and Goddard quickly reformulated their private service to serve Congress. It was a wartime expedience, specifically to keep correspondence with the Continental Army. Quickly, Franklin delegated his duties as the first Postmaster General to his son-in-law, Richard Botch. Under the Articles of Confederation, Congress maintained the power of establishing or regulating post offices from one state to another throughout all the United States and exacting such postage on the papers passing through the same as may be requisite to defray the expenses of the said office. Even under the Articles, which were weak at best on the ability of Congress to complete countrywide goals, the post office became a political football. In order to bolster stagecoach companies, Congress required contracts with them to carry the mail in 1785. This helped the loosely lined Confederation of States together and made them realize they needed stronger federal control. So in 1787, the US Constitution was formed to solve many of the issues of the Articles. and one of the passages specifically states, "The Congress shall have the power to establish post offices and post roads." So even in the Constitution, the power to create infrastructure improvements were tied directly to the post office. If you wanted a good road, it had to be made specifically for the post office. It was bolstered by the 1792 Postal Service Act, which established the post office as a department and made shipping newspapers throughout the country a priority, even granting them discounted postage rates. A well-informed public was crucial to continuing the American experiment. In 1790, there were only 75 post offices, so the first task was to expand the service throughout the fledgling republic. A decade later, there were more than 900. Accompanying this, there were over 80,000 miles of post roads by the 1820s. This helped push a political agenda called the American System. First proposed by Alexander Hamilton, it basically wanted a national bank to maintain an interconnected economy, protective tariffs to help industries grow, and using the excess funds from this to improve infrastructure. The post office was a key part of that third tenet. As canals and railroads became national issues, the only constitutional way for the federal government to subsidize their building was by officially connecting them as part of the post. Congress officially allowed waterways to be designated post roads in 1823 and railroads in 1838. The American system piggybacked on the postal system. In those days, many people's only interaction with the federal government was with the post office. Even elections were handled by the states, so the mail system was extremely efficient. Most Americans could keep up with the news, contacting their politicians with ease, and keep in contact with their relations from far away. In a country rapidly expanding westward, the post office was essential for maintaining ties with even the most far-flung areas of the country. On his tour through the United States, Alexis de Tocqueville said, "It is difficult to imagine the incredible rapidity with which thought circulates in the midst of these deserts. Having a post office is what allows the Census Bureau to recognize a small group of houses as a town. Otherwise, it's just another census-designated place." Given the outsized importance of the Post Department in politics, it may surprise you to find out that it was largely independent of direct presidential interference until 1829, when Andrew Jackson was inaugurated. Though Jackson would eventually remove one of the tenets of the American system, expanding the nation's infrastructure was somewhat bipartisan by the 1830s. Though the South fiercely opposed the tariffs necessary to pay for it, even though it was New York who actually felt the brunt of the tariff system. Jackson politicized the Postal Department a different way. He created the spoils system, where new presidents would fire a bunch of the appointees from the previous administration and appoint their own, which was always meant to award party loyalty. The most significant part of the spoils system was the Postal Department. In order to remove the relative independence of the department until this, Jackson elevated the postmaster to his cabinet. From then on, every post office throughout the country, big or small, was treated as a political position for the cronies of whomever was in power to get easy pay and a simple job. Jackson used this outweighed influence on the post office to censor speech. During his administration, several abolitionists became active. They banded together in 1835 to send a massive amount of abolitionist literature to the South. Jackson at first tried to have it officially disallowed, but Congress shot that bill down. After all, freedom of speech was sacred. Instead, Southern postmasters, put in power by Jackson, organized vigilantes to raid post offices at night. They sorted out the abolitionist papers from the mail and publicly burnt them. With all this politicization, numerous private mail carriers sprang up in the 1830s and 40s to skirt around the Post Department's official monopoly. It became so bad that in 1845, Congress patched up all the holes that allowed these private carriers to exist and basically ended their usurpation of the system. But the department did not rest on its laurels, for the dispute over the Oregon Territory was settled and the Mexican-American War began. This meant that the US annexed a massive amount of territory as a result. The subsequent California Gold Rush brought such an influx of population to the newly acquired West Coast that California became a state in 1850. Suffice it to say, postage had to get all the way across the suddenly enormous country. Back in 1815, Congress had allowed the post to charter steamboat companies. It was another way of sponsoring the American system. Recognizing the need to get mail to the other side of the continent, Congress chartered the Pacific Mail Steamship Company. which would ship mail from New York, south to American railroads or stagecoaches in Central America, and back northward to the West Coast. Though it was chartered before the gold rush, it rapidly became one of the primary ways of getting to California. In 1850, three financiers came together to form a parcel shipping company to handle distant travel necessary for the gold rush, while simultaneously offering rapid transport throughout the country. They were named Henry Wells, John Butterfield, and William Fargo. The company is American Express. Fargo and Butterfield already had their own stagecoach companies, and Wells founded his in cooperation with Fargo in 1852. They handled parcel shipping, but were subsidized by the Post Department. Since they often hauled money under such contracts, this is why American Express is a credit card company today, and Wells Fargo is a bank. In 1860, the Pony Express made the mail even quicker, but the company only lasted 18 months because change was on the horizon. These stage and express companies defined the West, and drove the call for a transcontinental railroad, which a full survey of the new lands was completed in 1855, though it got bogged down in sectionalism over which route to take. If it went south, then slavery would have more power to extend itself, which was exactly what the man in charge of the Pacific Railroad Survey proposed. After all, it was the Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis, who would later become president of the Confederacy. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, which caused Bleeding Kansas, was basically meant to give bipartisan support for a northern route by offering the slavery question in the Kansas and Nebraska territories to popular sovereignty rather than keeping them as free soil. This debate over the expansion of slavery caused the Civil War, and the Post Department is what enabled the government to subsidize railroads and therefore made the political necessity for the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Construction on the first transcontinental railroad in the U.S. began during that war, though it wouldn't be completed until afterward, but mail carriage along the track began in 1862. Before that, another development was paid for by that surprisingly elastic constitutional clause for postal roads. In 1837, Congress sponsored the creation of the countrywide optical telegraph, and in 1943, they sponsored Samuel Moore's electric telegraph. Only 2 years later, Washington, D.C. had the first of many telegraph offices, which were part of the Post Department. Congress authorized the first transcontinental telegraph in 1860 under the same auspices, which was completed only a year later. While private telegraph companies were absolutely dependent on the post office for revenue, an 1851 company would spell the demise of public telegraphy. Western Union bought up their competition, forming a telegraph monopoly that was powerful enough to lobby Congress to grant them the mail service over telegraphs, ending public offices by the early 1870s. This was the harbinger for much to come, but the Post Department remained important in numerous ways. As part of the spoils system, a young Abraham Lincoln got a job as postmaster in New Salem, Illinois, after having led a militia company in the Black Hawk War. This was his first political position, and when he was elected to Congress in the 1840s, he sat on the House Committee on Post Office and Post Roads, and so was part of the changes taking place during that time. Once he was elected president, the South seceded because they were too afraid of his moderately anti-slavery position, and their Confederacy was too impotent to gain independence or even recognition. During that war, the post office took on a significant role, which Mr. B will tell us all about.
Thanks, Cypher. Yeah, the American Civil War was the first time we saw widespread mail-in voting. The soldiers out there fighting on the battlefield couldn't make it back home to vote in person, so the federal government let them mail in their ballots. So mail-in voting has been around for quite a while. If you want to find out more about this, check out my video about the history of mail-in voting. After you're done watching this one, of course.
Be sure to check out his episode. After the war, Republicans gained control for the next half-century because Democrats were the conservatives of the day and the majority of voters yearned for progress. Even when Democrats took the presidency with Cleveland and Wilson, they had to at least pretend to be reformers. But with Republican control came the worst ravages of the spoils system. President Grant was constantly embroiled in scandals, one of which surrounded star routes. The Post Department labeled certain routes with an asterisk to denote that they were more difficult, and so those who handled them were compensated better. Under the spoils system, Grant's cronies jockeyed for these star routes, and many failed to perform their duties. Even after several congressional investigations, most got off free because Republicans wanted to maintain control regardless of the egg on their face. Eventually, the Republicans came to address their own corruption. President Garfield was elected with that explicit promise. He started a feud with a powerful senator named Roscoe Conkling by nominating someone else for Postmaster General and then other positions. Garfield even launched an investigation into post office fraud and profiteering. He supported a major overhaul of civil services proposed by Democratic Senator George H. Pendleton. Then a disgruntled office seeker assassinated Garfield, ending his short presidency. Within 18 months, Pendleton's act passed in memory of Garfield's effort to reform. It virtually ended the spoils system. As a result, the post office was once again fulfilling its progressive mandate set forth by the Constitution, uninhibited by political corruption. That's not to say it didn't play a political role. For instance, in 1873, Congress officially censored the mail. Named after the postal inspector at the time, these Comstock laws prohibited any lewd or lascivious material. Not only did that stop people from sending contraceptives or sex toys, but it also stopped them simply writing about anything sexual. Remember that newspapers were a primary part of the postal system, and you can see how this was a real infringement of the First Amendment right to free speech. Yet, it wasn't ruled on by the Supreme Court for almost a century. The Post Department continued to support innovation. While they'd already been supporting parcel postage throughout the 19th century, they became competitive internationally in 1887, when they extended the service to other countries, forging relations by helping those countries with their post offices, including Hawaii, where U.S. parcel postage was a key factor in organizing the coup that would ultimately deliver the islands to U.S. annexation. Of course, just like with telegraphs, this opened the Post Department to private competition. Parcel and messenger services between corporations were typically done by independent companies, and one of these would become a juggernaut. Founded in 1907 as the American Messenger Company, they were just one of many companies that primarily made special deliveries for the post office. But soon they started merging and consolidating power, just like Western Union. As they grew nationwide, the renamed United Parcel Service, or UPS, eventually started coming in direct competition with the Post Department. But they couldn't compete with all the other services the Post Department offered, as progressives sought to expand what the Post Department could do. In the 1890s, the Post Department started trying to deliver mail everywhere in the country. Before that, if you were too deep in farmland, you had to come to the post office to pick up your mail, or pay extra for distance covered. Delivery to nearby dwellings in the city was a measure taken by the Lincoln administration in 1863 to offer better information through newspapers during the Civil War, and that continues to the present. As people wanted to support new technologies like automobiles in the 1890s, Congress authorized expenditure to buy mail vehicles to make rural free delivery. In 1916, they even began the National Highway System specifically to support rural free delivery, which would be expanded in the 1950s to create the Interstate Highway System. Yes, highways are post roads, and that's what allows the federal government to constitutionally create and regulate them. In supporting all of this, the Post Department even tried to advance electric vehicles before the technology got subsumed by cheap oil prices. This was key to helping inventors like Henry Ford gain enough economic support to build his factory. When airplanes came along, the post office subsidized that technology too, by starting airmail in 1911. They even had a transcontinental route by 1920. Most early airlines were dependent on that regular revenue for carrying the mail all the way into the 1950s and 60s. As if the Post Department wasn't innovative enough, the same year they began subsidizing aircraft technology, they allowed people to deposit money with them, and that money would be invested in banks or bonds. The postal savings system became extremely popular because these deposits were backed by the federal government, and therefore didn't have much risk. It was the safest place to have your money when the financial system fell apart in 1929. But with the creation of the FDIC, as a result of the following depression, private banks gained federal backing. So it quickly fell out of favor except in rural areas where people didn't have access to banks, eventually being discontinued in 1967. Of course, with all that progressivism came Wilson! Woodrow Wilson segregated the Post Department upon coming to power. Before him, it was one of the few places black people could expect good employment. But Wilson made that impossible. When civil rights groups such as the NAACP petitioned him to rescind this policy, he stated, "Segregation is not a movement against the Negroes. We are rendering them more safe in their possession of the office and less likely to be discriminated against." Ah, classic Wilson, oppressing people and somehow making it sound optimistic. Well, segregation remained all the way until just before World War II. Seeing the war coming, FDR ordered, "There shall be no discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries or government because of race, creed, color, or national origin." Since the Post Department was part of the defense effort, having been founded as a wartime measure before even the Declaration of Independence, it was technically a defense industry. Order 8802 began the long process of desegregating post offices, which today are once again a bulwark against systemic inequality. That extended to veterans after the war. The Post Department actively hired veterans to keep them from destitution, and they do so today. It is an easy place to find a job for veterans, especially considering we're a group of people who disproportionately experience homelessness. The postal system remains a key part of fighting that issue. But that employment has always had its ups and downs. By 1970, postal workers felt they were paid too little. There were several unions, but they were not unified. And negotiations for wage increases were going nowhere because of this division, and Congress had just authorized a major salary increase for themselves. The hypocrisy was palpable, so mailmen in New York started walking off the job.
We want to work, but this is the only means we have of letting Congress know that we cannot take it any longer. Either they give us what we should have, or we will stay on strike until hell freezes over.
The strike spread rapidly to over 150,000 postal workers. It was the largest strike in federal history, and their unions did not authorize it. Despite it being what's called a wildcat strike, it was quite successful, though Nixon had to call in troops to distribute mail for a time.
Can you imagine instead of having a letter carrier deliver the mail, having a guy with a bayonet walk into an office building? It's going from the ridiculous to the sublime. Boy, the carriers are the heartland of America. It's terrible.
They still got a massive raise and a new federal union. But this came at a massive cost. The Postal Reorganization Act made the Post Department into the Postal Service, a federal agency rather than a cabinet-level administration. The intent was to remove any political influence on further labor bargaining. After all, the raising of Postmaster General to the cabinet in 1829 was specifically for that purpose. Though the spoil system was long gone by 1970, Postmaster Generals were still a very political position. But this backfired, because Nixon treated the newly created USPS as a corporation. The post office was suddenly supposed to turn a profit. Though they'd continue to receive federal subsidies for more than a decade, this was one of the outcroppings of a new economic ideology: neoliberalism. Nixon was no neoliberal, nor Ford, but every president since then has been. The main idea of neoliberalism is the elimination of public or government services in favor of privatization. Neoliberals emphasize individual responsibility over societal uplift, and their main policy goals are cutting government programs, emphasizing trickle-down economics, and deregulation. Though Carter was a bit of a neoliberal, Reagan was the epitome of it, hence why the last federal subsidy to the USPS was in 1984. Federal funding since then has only been in the form of bailouts, because the post office is supposed to be self-sustaining. Given services like rural free delivery and low rates, USPS already had trouble turning a profit. Neoliberals believe in the free market bolstering things on its own, unlike how every major new technology has been subsidized by the Post Department since the inception of this country. With USPS relegated to being a supposedly profit-making agency, it hasn't been able to invest in expansion and has steadily declined in the number of post offices and services since then. As such, a private company quickly took the innovative spirit away from USPS. Formed the same year as USPS, FedEx offered new services like overnight shipping and automated package tracking. Even today, their main client is actually USPS. But their implementation of these services were much slower and less universally available than when the Post Department implemented the zip code system in 1963. But USPS is not seen like the Post Department was. Helped along by President Carter's executive order allowing private delivery in 1979, in open defiance of the 1840s courier codes, FedEx became a competitor with USPS, and those courier codes were eventually repealed under Reagan. That's not to say the USPS has never turned a profit. Starting in 1991, contracts with FedEx and UPS allowed for what's called last-mile delivery, where those corporations handed parcels off to USPS to make the final delivery, since they have the infrastructure to go to every house in America. This meant they turned a profit, even when emails started taking a significant chunk of their postal revenue starting in the early 2000s. They had tried to use electronic mail by having a printing system from 1982 to 84, but it was barely used and quickly cut. Though not before federally funded engineers made a way for government employees to communicate over email they called the Post Office Protocol, which POP3 continues as the standard protocol today, even though it was originally intended for the governmental internet called ARPANET. USPS launched a website in 1994, and for the rest of the decade, they proposed creating an email service which any American could have access to at their local office or in their home. Even the famously libertarian think tank RAND thought it was a good idea, despite that going against neoliberal interests. But businesses were allowed to take over the email industry anyways. Imagine how different a world we'd live in if USPS was the standard email address for all Americans, just like their mailing addresses, with all the legal restrictions against spying that would entail. USPS could have been at the forefront of the digital frontier, just like they had with so many frontiers before that. But USPS was forced to continue downsizing just as neoliberals wanted. They continued to turn a profit throughout the 90s and early 2000s, but in 2006, that ended. Republicans passed legislation seemingly designed to cripple the USPS. The Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act required USPS to not raise stamp prices faster than yearly inflation, despite the fact that those prices were already artificially low. It mandated a delivery on Saturdays, and worst of all, it required them to pay all employees' retirement and medical benefits 50 years in advance. This is an especially onerous requirement, which no corporation or other federal agency is required to do. So USPS stopped making a profit. It's counterintuitive when people call for privatizing the USPS because it's not profitable. After all, they're the ones that made it so. And that is in direct contradiction with the spirit of the US Constitution. The post office was an instrument of democracy. The fledgling republic needed an informed citizenry, especially as we enfranchised more and more voters. But just as the second to last constitutional amendment was ratified in 1971, that view changed. As one article derisively states, for nearly 2 centuries taxpayers had funded the post office to help build a nation. Now, the nation was deemed built. The post office has always been a political tool. That's precisely its strength. We have highways, canals, railroads, a car and plane industry, and a refuge for those who find trouble being hired, all for the sake of maintaining a well-informed citizenry. So the Postal Service has been a vital instrument of our democracy. But under neoliberal eyes, the USPS is supposed to turn a profit. As such, politicians have been calling for its privatization for decades, just as they undermine it with legislation and budget cuts. Perhaps this is American navel-gazing. After all, numerous countries have privatized their post offices, including the United Kingdom, from which ours originally grew. But the difference is, USPS is fundamental to our Constitution. For those who supposedly hold that document so dear, to call for privatization and undermine that institution is the height of hypocrisy. Then again, maybe we've reached a point where an uninformed populace is helpful for politicians to maintain their power.
King. Really? I just started recording, come on. Yet it's also been a way... See what I have to deal with? He just randomly decides, hey, I'm gonna be noisy now. When I started researching this episode, I had no idea about the importance of the post office. I know this was a long episode and I kinda skimped on doing a lot of editing in parts of it, but that's how much of a surprise it was to me. I just had to say my piece. If you want to read more on this yourself, there's a link to the USPS's page with numerous statistics and documents available, and to the Postal Museum, which is ran by the Smithsonian. They've got tons of research papers available, all of which were quite enlightening. As you've seen throughout this, when we talk about privatizing the post office or how profitable it should be, we are fundamentally misunderstanding what that institution is. We face a postal crisis because of this. People are arguing about how much to fund the post office or whether it should be privatized, much of it hinging on them arguing about politicizing the post office. It's always been political, from the Federalists and Whigs supporting the American system, Democrats and Republicans using it for spoils, progressives trying to advance our society, and finally neoliberalism. It's always been a harbinger of the current politics of our country. Conversation shouldn't be about how political the post office is. Honestly, I've never seen a sincere reason for anything being apolitical, let alone something created by politicians and for politics. Just about any call saying, "keep politics out of X," is a call for denial, not impartiality. The post office should be seen as an instrument of our democracy, a tool for fostering infrastructural and technological growth, and most importantly, a means of keeping this entire nation well-connected and informed. That is its function. To use the post office as a profit-making venture is to abuse not only it, but our Constitution itself.
By the way, thanks to Private Internet Access for sponsoring this video. Click on the link below to get that discount and the free months of their service. Also, don't forget to check out Mr. Beats' episode. I'll see y'all next time.